Hi, welcome to today's webinar, Driver Qualifications Town Hall, Hot Topics in DQ File Management, presented by J.G. Keller and Associates. I'm Trish Flowers from Automated Fleet, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. I encourage you to ask questions during the webinar at any point, and we will try to address them all. However, if we do not get to yours, don't worry. You will be contacted by email with a response after the event. I am joined by our speakers today, Mark Scheduler, Senior Transportation Editor, and Kathy Close, Transportation Editor at J.J. Keller and Associates. Thank you for being here. Tell us a little bit more about yourselves.
All right. Well, I'm Mark Scheduler. I spent 25 years in trucking and then had the good fortune of coming to J.J. Keller. I cover driver qualification, passenger carrier regulations, and vehicle safety technologies.
And I'm Kathy Close. I've been with J.J. Keller. I just had my 26th anniversary this past month. I started out acting as a third-party administrator in our managed services area, where I audited driver qualification files, and I managed DOT drug and alcohol testing programs. And since 2002, I've been in the editorial department, and I've been working on those areas in print and electronic publications.
All right, so today's webcast is brought to you by J.J. Keller's Fleet Mentor. It's awesomely newly upgraded. It's your 24/7 partner for managing fleet responsibilities faster, more accurately, and certainly with fewer headaches. Join the thousands of safety professionals who rely on Fleet Mentor every day to make more informed decisions, reduce your expenses, ensure driver compliance, and improve vehicle performance. And on behalf of our sponsor, thanks so much for joining us. And now Kathy's going to take us through the agenda.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark. And thanks everyone for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend. We know that a lot of you guys have a lot on your plates. So Mark and I today are going to focus on our most frequently asked questions in this area. And from DQ file basics to medical certification, motor vehicle records, along with some consequences of non-compliance. And we're going to address as many questions as possible along the way at the end. But we'd also like your feedback on how to handle certain scenarios. Mark, so how are you doing today?
I am doing well. Thanks for asking. I was working furiously on Fleet Mentor 2.0 or upgraded Fleet Mentor policies right before this webcast. I assure you they're awesome. And we're going to start a discussion about DQ rules that apply. So go ahead and start submitting questions in any area that has been perplexing you lately in the DQ area. All right, so one that I get, now that I took it over from Kathy a few years ago. So do we need DQ files for our drivers? It's more common than you may think. Sounds pretty basic, but it depends on the vehicles they operate and whether they operate intra-state only or if they're supporting interstate commerce. So for drivers that cross state lines or otherwise support interstate commerce, the definition of a commercial motor vehicle is in section 390.5 of the FMCSRs. And as summarized here, it includes drivers operating in any area open to public travel. That's important, which includes private property. And a key point here, it's not just CDL drivers that need a file. That is a huge misconception. It includes large pickups or pickup hooked to a trailer usually, box trucks, etc. If you're operating in interstate commerce, and then if you're a passenger carrier, the vehicle's rated 9 to 15 passengers, including the driver, or vans, buses, placarded vehicles of any size, and so on. So if anyone is operating a commercial motor vehicle under your authority, any person that's in your truck operating on a highway for compliance purposes, your driver. Doesn't matter who's paying them. It includes full-time company drivers, yard jockeys, temp drivers, temp agency drivers, contractors that are leased under your authority, etc. Even the owner of the company, if they want to jump in a vehicle and drive it, they have to be qualified. So a full DQ file from 391.51 is required unless there's a very narrow exception and they drive for more than one company at a time, and there's some other stipulations, but they have to work for 2 or more carriers in a 7-day period. So it doesn't apply to a lot of people, and you're taking risks by shortcutting the DQ file. That's just my opinion from 25 years in trucking. The temp agency, however, can create a file for you as your agent, just like Keller does for many people. But otherwise, they're in your truck. You own them for DQ file purposes.
That's good points there. And a follow-up question we often get is, what if we only operate in our state and never cross the border? Well, if you operate as an intrastate carrier, and that means your drivers and vehicles don't cross state lines, you'd follow what your state's requirements might be, which could be the same or different than the federal requirements. Many states adopt the federal rules verbatim, but many also have exceptions for age, vehicle size, medical issues, and other topics. And then there's others who adopt their own rules entirely. In most states, compliance with these requirements is based on the vehicle weight or weight rating. Now, these weight thresholds can vary from state to state. They can range from 10,001 pounds and up, which mimics the federal definition, all the way up to 26,001 pounds, which maybe they're mimicking the CDL definition. So if you have a driver who's qualified in your state, it's important to realize that the driver might not be qualified to cross state lines or engage in interstate commerce even once. And if the driver has a CDL, that person may in fact have an intrastate only restrictions on the license.
Okay, so at this time, we are going to take our first break for a few questions. Let me see what we have. Okay, so for the first question, it says, the new MedCard and SDLA integration on June 23rd, 2025 has FMCSA given a time frame on once a new MedCard is issued. How long does a motor carrier have to run a new MVR to verify medical information is updated?
Well, Kelly, I can tell you, I sent 2 follow-ups to FMCSA and no response. So technically, the regulations still say the MVR has to be in the file to replace the MedCard, which won't be issued June 23rd and later, within 15 days. So you still have 15 days by regulation. Your MVR will be updated, hopefully in 2 to 4 days. We'll get into this more in depth, but the answer is still 15 days, but I would do it as soon as possible.
Okay, we're going to answer one more question. Does a mechanic who test drives a CMV need a DQ file?
Sure, I'll take that one. If they're operating on what they call a highway, which can include a public roadway or private property with access, the public can come in, like I come in with my car and turn around because I'm lost. That's a highway. That person operating at CMV is a driver. HR doesn't look, so they don't look at HR job titles. They look at drivers, anybody operating at CMV. So even though they're a mechanic, technician, even a supervisor, anybody else, the job title is a driver operating a CMV. So yes, they would need a DQ file, and the other areas of the FMCSRs would also apply.
Okay, great. I'm going to hand it back over to Mark and Kathy.
Yeah, thanks. So we're going to move on to our next frequently asked question that we get is, what if our DQ files have missing documents? Now, Mark, you know, that's a common one. We get that one at least once a week, I think.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, those questions are easily answered when you go to how long do you keep those documents? You know, the questions are in 391.51 and 391.53, pretty straightforward. So you took over managing of maybe your fleet's DQ files, or maybe our acquisition or something. Something's missing. What do you do? How do you limit the liability? Well, one recent example was, you know, I talked to a safety director, self-auditing their files, predated that person. I actually just had one like that today, and it's just driver had been with the company over a decade, never had a road test. didn't have the previous employer check done. I'm sure you guys, a lot of you out there probably can relate to this. How do you fix that situation? Well, the first thing you could do is you got to look at subpart G to part 391. We'll probably throw some reg references out there to you, but we're reg nerds, so we live in the FMCSR. So anyway, you have to see if there's any exceptions that might apply. If you figure out there is in fact, there's a violation and there's no way to erase these types of violations. You may be cited if it's caught by an auditor. There may be things you can do to mitigate the damage and show what they term a good faith effort to comply. First, don't ever try to hide the violation, because that's considered falsification. You don't want to be accused of that, because that carries a pretty hefty penalty. You may even want to document in the file the fact that you know about the violation, you discovered it during the self-audit, and you have taken steps to correct it. First, determine how long it's been missing and ask yourself whether it makes sense to create or fix the document now. Can you still contact the previous employer, for example? Does it make sense to take a driver out for a road test or have them fill out an application? How long have they been with you? Does it make sense? Or do you have an old copy of the driver's CDL to use in place of the road test? Whatever your decision, be sure to document your efforts so the DOT knows you made a good faith effort to comply. Here's another caution for you. Don't ever backdate anything. That's important because you don't want to be cited again for falsification. Again, you could get penalized for that and have a huge FMCSA fine on your hands. And finally, make sure the violations don't happen again. Put a note in the file indicating that, again, the violation exists. What safety controls have you put in place so that it doesn't happen again? They're going to be looking for that.
All right, and rehires, that is a popular topic. And anytime there is a break in employment, meaning they were taken off your driver roster, the DQ file just can't pick up where it left off, like if you took a leave of absence. So you can't just check their medical card and license and say, they look good, let's keep going. So when there is no break of employment and you expect the driver to return, that is just to bring the file up to date before they operate a CMV case. So in the case of a rehire, break in employment, you have to create a brand new driver application, top to bottom, based on their rehire date, not the prior date. You do whatever you need to for pay purposes, but the application date needs to be when they sign it, review it, and such. So you'll be listed as a former employer on the application. The original the date of separation, your dates of employment should be on there. And then you have to get a new MVR for that driver. A non-CDL driver, you have 30 days to get that MVR, but who would want to take 30 days to find out if that driver can actually operate a CMV or not? So just like a new hire that you never qualified before, make sure you run the MVR and check from their active state of licensing at a minimum before you let them operate. Using the 30-day window has risk, is all I'll say. For a CDL driver, if you're accepting their current medical certification and you're not sending them for a new one, we'll talk a lot about the CDL integration in a bit. You have to run the MVR because you have to have proof of medical certification before they operate the CMV. Anytime that the medical certification, like before June 23rd, they're probably still issuing med cards. June 23rd later, the examiner doesn't have to. So there won't be a med card to sit in the file. So running that MVR as soon as possible is important. So the date will be updated sometime in the future as to how long you have, as I talked to that first question. So you will need a note in the file for any exam that you accept. You can maybe reuse a note, but if it's the same med card, I would certainly make sure you verify that the examiner was on the registry. For CDL drivers, June 23rd and later, that examiner verification goes away because of the SDLA National Registry integration. So non-CDL drivers, nothing changes for proof of medical certification. CDL drivers, a lot changes, and we'll talk in depth. When you're using the new driver application, you have to see if there's any DOT regulated employers that were between when they separated and when you hired them again. You have to redo, or you have to do those safety performance histories, but you don't have to redo anything that was done correctly previously with DOT regulated employers. And then from a drug testing standpoint, just CDL drivers, you have to have a pre-employment query showing the driver's not prohibited. The clearinghouse will notify you for 12 months after you run that query if anything changes, such as they have 2 jobs and they get popped on another job. Also, you have to have a negative drug test for any CDL driver that you're rehiring, pre-employment test. And you could use the exception in 382, 301B and C, but it may take longer than you want to get the driver moving because you have to get documentation from a prior employer. They have to have been in a program, etc. Might be easier to just send them for an exam. So, Kathy, the probably the more interesting part of the question is, what can you recycle with a rehire?
Yeah, you probably said, what can save on time? You know, you need that driver. Well, if the drivers had a road test certificate issued by your company or another FMCSA regulated carrier that was dated within the past 3 years of the rehire date, you can use that. You don't have to do another road test. If it's older than 3 years, sorry to tell you, but you're gonna have to perform a new road test. Now, a copy of the CDL used in lieu of a road test, if it's still valid, that's the current license, it can be reused. And you can also reuse safety performance histories previously completed. Now, if it fits within the 3 years of the rehire date. For non-CDL drivers, you can reuse a copy of the medical examiner certificate if the driver did not have a new exam while they were away. And you probably can reuse the note that you verified the examiner was certified. Those are the items, the items that you can't recycle are kept as if the driver never returned. And that's for 3 years from the date of the separation. Now, here's the example of what would you purge after 3 years? Well, that would be the original application, the safety performance histories that don't fall under the rehire date that you couldn't recycle, road tests over 3 years old med cards, initial MVR from the first hire date, previous MVRs, whether annual MVRs or used as proof of that medical certification for your CDL holders, all annual reviews. So yeah, those things would all be purged as if the driver never returned.
All right, and I talked about Fleet Mentor earlier. That's a way to keep your DQ files electronically. Yes, you can, and you don't have to keep the hard copies around forever. That's based on 390.32. As long as the documents are readable and they have all the information you need, you can keep them electronically. As the reg used to state, you can put them on microfiche. So anyway, can you use copies in place of original? Yes, the answer is yes. Also, and for auditing purposes, be sure to keep the file organized, whether it's hard copy or electronic. If it's electronic, it's got to be indexed to the correct driver and recallable in the event of an audit in short order. And if you have extra non-DOT, non-required documents like personnel stuff, you might not want to store those in the actual DQ file. Lean and clean is what I would say. It's easier to audit rather than make the auditor pick through things that are like performance documents, etc. You might want to have a separate file for non-required documents. And documents might be reviewable electronically, if it depends on the auditor, but they may make you print them, but at least they're easy to find and well organized. Drug and alcohol records are better stored separately for sure, because they have to be under more strict security requirements. And record keeping is an area in which you want to have a mechanism in place to verify that the required documents are gathered. And when you're hiring, especially, the potential drivers are kept moving through the process. So consider using a paperless online system like J.J. Keller Fleet Mentor to ensure you stay on track. And because Fleet Mentors are sponsoring service, we're offering all attendees complimentary access. And I would certainly jump on Fleet Mentor is upgraded version, which I think is what you would get versus the legacy, which was great, but this one's even better, frankly. That's just my opinion. And please use the poll to select your areas of interest, and along with your complimentary access, we'll email you a popular white paper, top fleet management practices for streamlining your operations. And it looks like it's a question time again.
All right, a lot of great information so far. Let me see. For our first question, what do we do if we cannot get previous employers to respond to the 3-year background check?
Oh, I think that's Kathy's favorite question.
I will take that one, yes. FMCSA, it's okay. You're not in violation if the previous employer doesn't respond. You have to just document your good faith effort. You have to do more than one attempt at getting this information in the first 30 days of hire. You have to have that documented record, and that's what you need. The industry standard is 3 attempts in 30 days, but they use the word, there's a plural in the regs, so at least 2, but I'd say 3. And it doesn't have to be always remailing it out to them. You could document a phone call. I called, ABC Trucking and talked to Joe, safety manager, and they said they're not at liberty to release that information. You just document what happened, or left messages for Joe, safety manager, never return the calls. You have to show 3 attempts. Now, you can report them to FMCSA, and then it's in FMCSA's hands. If a former DOT employer fails to respond, they'll take the action. It's, you're compliant, you're fine, just document your attempts.
Excellent.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. All right, we have time for one more question right now. And the question says, in regards to the upcoming changes to the medical card process, if a non-CDL driver goes in for a medical exam to get a medical card, will that information end up in the state records? These will be for drivers who drive pickup trucks with the possibility of towing trailers, which could weigh over 10,001 pounds.
There is no mechanism to house non-CDL driver medical certification information. So this whole CDL medical certification process does not apply to non-CDL drivers. However, if the way I heard the question, if that trailer is over 10,000 pounds and the combination's over 26, you have a CDL required vehicle. So that kind of makes it a different question. But non-CDL driver medical information does not have to be submitted or be on file with the state unless it is otherwise required. I've heard of like school bus driver type requirements, but for a regular property carrying vehicle, I know of no states that require non-CDL. There is no mechanism to house it, in short.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to you and Kathy.
Yeah. Next on our question, one of our frequently asked questions, who needs a road test and when can we skip the test? Okay. Well, if you have any road test questions, we start entering those too. We will address some of those at the back end of this little segment. So who needs a road test? Well, that's the same answer as who needs a DQ file. Anyone operating a CMV as defined in section 390.5, and they're working under your DOT number. So they're your driver, they're your responsibility, and it's a part of your DQ file. Also, we get asked who can perform or administer a road test. Okay, so it's anyone that you as the motor carrier deem qualified or competent to do so. It can be someone in-house, like a supervisor or a seasoned driver, or you can contract that task out to someone if you'd like. The person has to be able to judge the driver's abilities. If testing in a CDL vehicle, however, you may want the evaluator to hold the CDL. That's just in case something goes wrong during the test and you may need to get that vehicle back. When should the road
I've
test
had to do.
Yeah, well, in real life, it does happen. And I also say be able to defend your choice of evaluator. I've had questions from customers saying they're in a lawsuit and they're asking the qualifications of the person to perform the road test on the driver in question. So just be able to defend your decision. So anyway, When should the road test be performed? Well, that's before the first dispatch or any other work in support of the business. Now, exceptions. When do we not have to do a road test? Well, here's a reg reference for you. I'm the reg nerd here. Section 391.33, that allows a motor carrier to use a copy of existing road test certificate. So you could, for example, if it's a rehire situation, which you went through, you can use it if it's in the last 3 years. Another carrier performed one and the driver has a certificate. You could use that if you want. The exception is also an exception that applies that you can use a copy of a CDL in lieu of a road test, but that does not apply if you're hiring that driver to operate tank vehicles, doubles, or triples. In those cases, you must perform a road test on a representative vehicle. I always caution people that if you do accept somebody else's road test, you are accepting their standards. So just a little caution there. I know, Mark, you would agree with that.
100%.
You can do a pre-employment drug test after a road test before the first dispatch, according to FMCSA. A finer point is that a vehicle can't be used on a dispatch as a part of the road test. If there's any doubt as to whether your road test supports the business operation or is otherwise using commerce, do the query, the pre-employment query, and receive a negative drug test result before the road test. So if you're ever in doubt, better to, err on the side of caution. As far as pre-employment query of the CDL driver, the query can be done after the road test as long as the road test is before hiring the driver. That's how that reg is worded. You must have it before hire. They don't talk about performing a safety sensitive function before a road test. It's before hire.
All right. So there is a misconception out there, and I have kind of gone through this with several customers, that if they leave a driver off for more than 30 days, they have to be re-examined by a medical examiner. Now, this really only comes up when they're on workers' compensation. They're off for an illness, typically not if they take a vacation or a leave of absence, but typically when they're hurt. So Kathy, what's your wisdom here for drivers that are out for more than 30 days?
Well, a carrier may have a company policy to have drivers medically requalified after an extended absence or work-related injury, but FMCSA doesn't require the DOT exam unless that injury or illness could cause the driver to be unsafe or unable to carry out their normal duties. So you have to make a judgment call. It's always a good practice after an extended absence to check the driver's medical certification and license. Is everything current? As well as run the annual MVRs, annual review. Anything that's missing in the DQ file, bring it up to date. For CDL vehicle drivers, the annual clearinghouse may be overdue. It's, make sure that you're running that and keep that up to date. The driver may have been in the latest poll for a random drug test as well. So when they come back, make sure you're sending the driver for that drug test. I know that's a different topic, but it's all related. Get these items done before allowing the driver to operate a CMV for you. Now, some mistakenly think that they have to send a driver who's out on a leave of absence for a drug test automatically when they return. It's only required if, for instance, the driver was selected for random during the absence, like I said, but it wouldn't be pre-employment, or if you mistakenly removed them from your random pool for more than 30 days, as a result, now you need a new pre-employment test. Any amount of time removed from the random pool requires a new pre-employment query of the clearinghouse. So just make sure you're doing that. But if a test is not required under Part 382, the carrier should not request the test after a leave of absence as a standard practice. DOT test is not required. It would be a violation to do something. It would have to be a non-DOT test under your policy and done within the confines of state and federal employment laws, because it's what's permitted versus what's required.
And Kathy, I'll be a reg nerd for a second. If anybody wants to know where this FMCSA guidance is on injuries, 391.45 question 3 will tell you that any driver that's returning doesn't need an exam unless they've had an illness or injury that might make them unsafe. But 391.45 interpretation number 3 is where you can actually get some verbiage on that.
Okay, great. At this time, we are going to take another break to answer a few questions. So for our first question, what is the best way to certify a manager to test the potential drivers with a road test or existing drivers?
Well, I would say If you're using a supervisor who's not a driver by title, I would create a DQ file on them, and because they have to be qualified to operate that vehicle if you want to expect them to drive that vehicle back. So make sure that they are actually a driver by FMCSA definition, even if they're not a driver by your HR definition. Mark, what would you lend an advice on this?
Well, I was a road test examiner for a while, and I do not have a CDL. I have probably a good sense of what looks like an unsafe habit and doesn't, because I went through truck driving school at my first large employer with Orange Trucks. I spent 3 weeks learning how to drive a truck and learned about the Smith system and all of that stuff. So the carrier that was utilizing me felt safe in using me in select situations. So I would make sure that you have examined any manager that hasn't driven before, driven a CMV before, examine their sense of what's safe, what's not safe, their knowledge of things like the Smith system or the J.J. Keller system for defensive driving. Those kinds of things really should be questioned, because some want to just chit chat with the driver while they're driving. Well, that's distracting them versus looking at mirror scans, how often their eyes are scanning, following distance, and all of those important things on the road that are important on a road test to look for.
Thank you, Mark. That is going to be it for our questions under the topic of road tests. So I will go ahead and hand it back over to Kathy and Mark. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, you can submit some questions now as we begin talking about background checks here, including MVRs. A common question has been, do we still need the driver's consent to request prior FMCSA regulated employers' dates of employment and DOT crash history for the past 3 years? As a reminder, the safety performance history no longer includes the DOT testing for FMCSA testing. That has to be done through the queries of the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. So for the pre-employment queries, the driver's consent is done by the driver in their personal account in the clearinghouse. So, but if a driver's worked in another mode, for example, somebody comes to you with an application and they worked in pipeline or transit authority, maybe they were in the railroad or something, the rail industry, they were in a Part 40 drug and alcohol program, you have to contact those former DOT employers about possible DOT testing violations, since that information is not covered in the clearinghouse, only captures Part 382 violations. In those instances, you do need the driver's specific written consent to request the drug and alcohol history. Now, back to that current safety performance history format. To be compliant with privacy laws that may apply, we still recommend that you get the driver's consent, even though it is not asking for FMCSA drug and alcohol history anymore. For the dates of employment, accident verification, that former employer still might want to see that signature from the driver. They want to just make sure they're not just releasing it without consent, even though it may not be required. And how do we document the inquiry to previous employers? Always keep a copy of the inquiries you sent, a note who the information was sent to, when it was sent. Keep it in the safety performance history for the length of employment plus 3 years. Keep a copy of any information sent out on your drivers, any previous or current drivers, anybody soliciting information from you. You keep what you sent for 1 year. Now, a fairly hot topic is that FMCSA doesn't prohibit prior employers from charging fees for safety performance history. You're like, what? Yeah, that's they have to provide the information. Even their pending payment, though, they still have to provide the information, but they still can charge for it. You're expected to make a good faith effort when it comes to these inquiries. The regs are not, specific, but a common practice is to make more than one attempt. Like I said, at least 3 to the first 30 days is a common practice. Document all those attempts. Some carriers, for instance, mail the first attempt, then document a follow-up phone call, and they can mail it out again, do an email attachment, whatever medium you use. And the other new hire investigation consent for running licensing agency MVRs depends on the respective agency process, whether you need consent and to what degree. The main thing to remember is that you must follow the particular state licensing agency's procedures, and they can vary. we know states have a lot of information.
Okay, great. So right now we are waiting to see if we have any questions in regards to background checks. Just a reminder, if you did submit a question in the previous category, we are going to wait towards the end to try to answer those for you. But if you have a question right now concerning background checks, go ahead and submit it.
Well, I see that Sandra's asking, what are the most common mistakes in a DQ file? And one of them is not making more than one attempt to documenting more than one attempt to obtain the safety performance history. That's fairly high up. Another one is, hey, let's promote this forklift driver to truck driver, commercial motor vehicle driver, and they don't use a DOT application, because the DOT application requires several elements, one of which is their date of birth and social security number. Those are not protected. So because there's a higher safety standard that has to be met. So you have to make sure any internal promotions or that office person that's going to drive once in a while has a DOT application. Kathy, what other of the most common things that you hear about?
Well, if you look at the A&I site, a lot of times just not sending out the inquiry is the safety performance history is a violation. Also, I know with roadside inspection and A&I for audits is not using a medically qualified driver. So either you're not tracking the expiration dates, and also not using a properly licensed driver, and that's big on roadside inspections and DOT audit stats that talk about you're not checking the MVR, you're not doing a tracking system to find out when things are expiring, you're not following up, and that's probably why this is happening. It comes down to having the administrative program in place that you can keep track of a lot of details, and apparently some things are falling through the cracks.
Right.
Great, and it looks like we have one more question. Does an owner-operator need a documented road test if they are a one-truck company or lease onto a carrier?
Yes, they do. They would have to get somebody else that's competent to administer the road test and document it. Under 391.31, in 391.31F, there's a very good example of the certificate that they're supposed to have in the file, and they need to fill that out. The road test evaluation form is whatever you want to use, but 391.31B, I think, lists all the elements you have to check for. Keller has a great road test form that I think a lot of people already use. You don't have to document things that the person's not going to encounter in their job. You'd have to show it like as not applicable. But yes, an owner operator needs a documented road test from somebody. They may have to, just contract with somebody to do it for them.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Right now, that wraps up our questions for background. I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to you and Kathy. Thank you.
All right. So what do regs require for a possible sleep apnea and a second opinion? Well, there's not enough time to do a deep dive into sleep apnea, but it's still a hot topic since the examiner handbook was updated in January of last year. The update made it even more clear that testing is not required by regulation, but it's up to the certified medical examiners. Some examiners or clinics are more strict than others. And what I get, how I see this manifested is, hey, can I go for a second opinion? And then if I ask another, probing question, well, the driver was told to go for a sleep study. Well, of course, that's usually what triggers a second opinion. And they can go for a second opinion if they're ordered for a sleep study, but you now have an exam that is on record saying that driver admitted to something that made that examiner in their medical history, that made that examiner want to send them for a sleep study, which is daytime sleepiness is one. There's some body characteristics and stuff that fall under that, but there's a medical review board letter from 2016 that's very in-depth that examiners should be following. So depending on the severity, and I had a driver that was, I'm sure, well over the extreme level. We sent him for an exam way before any of this stuff was talked about. It changed his life. I mean, he really thanked us for sending him for the exam. Didn't fight it, but some drivers, they don't want to. It's expensive, so they don't want to pay for the test, etc. And depending on the severity, if they do the study and they come back. They got to have a CPAP reading of at least 30 days showing that they used it for 4 hours a night on 70% of the days. I get that question a lot. And then, so if they show compliant and the examiner, they might put them in pending status if they're not severe, which means, hey, I'll let you go do this, bring it back, bring your data back to me. So there's ways to work it with the original examiner versus trying to all out avoid the first opinion, go for the second opinion, and then sort of not share the same medical history with the second examiner, which is falsification of an exam, and they can be subject to civil penalties, the driver that is, if FMCSA catches a failure followed by a pass, and then they can compare the two long forms and they go, oh, you told this examiner A you had daytime sleepiness that was severe. Second examiner, you didn't share that, and they passed you. So that's a problem. So you have to be truthful, accurate, health history. Yes, you're more than welcome to go for a second opinion, but letting drivers go for second opinions is a bit risky as a carrier because all that stuff in the first exam's documented, and you're not going to know if they told the same story unless you literally get consent to compare both long forms with from each examiner. So, all right, here we are. Our procedures for CDL and non-CDL medical certification the same? Yes and no. The medical criteria is the same. They do not have any different medical standards, 391, 41, B. They have to be medically qualified the same. The forms are the same, although examiners in less than 3 weeks won't get a medical card unless they ask for one. But there's a exam form that is detailed. Those are both the same. The difference happens after the exam is done. For non-CDL drivers, the medical certificate is what they should receive if they pass. That's their proof. They carry it with them, give a copy to the company, and they go on their merry way. CDL holders, driver licensing privileges are tied to their CDL, and no later than June 23rd, 2025, 21 out of 50 only, 21 states out of 50 are showing on the website as transitioned to the new process. So some of you have already gone through it, but no later than June 23rd. The licensing authorities are getting direct updates from the National Registry of Certified Medical Examiners, which requires the examiner, which they've been doing forever, enter the exam into the system after they're done on what's called an MCSA 5850. And then now the states and the registry are connected. Now the driver doesn't have to walk over or submit online a copy of their medical card to the DMV. So that's changing throughout this entire transition, but it's supposed to be done. All 50 states are supposed to be done by June 23rd. The CDL drivers currently carry their card for up to 15 days. And then after the MVR updates, they don't have to carry the card. Well, now, unless you guide them, require them to ask for a medical card so they have some proof, they won't they will not have any proof with them. If their exam is expired and they're operating a CMV, they're probably going to be put out of service. The med card might not get them off the hook, but it's better than having no proof. And as I said before, the window is 15 days to get the MVR in the file. It's realistically, it's taking 2 to 4 days to get the MVR updated, which means, in 4 or 5 days, you should have that MVR in the file. The examiner has until midnight the following day after the exam to enter the exam. So it's not going to happen like that. you have to count for that 2 to 4 day window. So it's not as clean as FMCSA may have thought it was ahead of time. All right, so a lot of conversation, a lot of questions. I talked about part of it already, not the least of which is the examiners aren't required. Some are refusing, literally, even when the driver, one of our trainers, our high-level trainers, asked for their medical card copy, and they said no. They're not doing their CDL drivers any favors. So you might want to check with your clinics if you have preferred clinics. Hey, are you issuing cards? One I checked with is absolutely not stopping issuing cards because they still have to issue them for non-CDL drivers. And there's no updated number of days to be in the file. If you want to check, has your state transitioned and you just didn't get exposed to it yet? The URL is on the slide, and I checked yesterday and it was 21 out of 50. Might be a new one today. One of the big deals, though, is that CDL drivers can't forget that every time they need, they get a new CDL or CLP, they upgrade from a B to an A or C to B or whatever, or they renew their CDL, they have to make a choice and self-certify with the licensing authority as to whether they're inter or intrastate and whether they're accepted, meaning they don't need a medical exam, and there's very few that don't need a medical exam, or non-accepted, which means, hey, you got to be medically qualified. So there's a lot to pack in. We have a webcast on the June 16th. Kathy and I are doing that, just devoted to this topic. There's a lot more. So look at our website or whatever for that webcast if you're still wondering what some of the details are, have a lot of questions.
Yeah, totally. I have to say, out of all the questions we're receiving and in our team for transportation motor carriers, it's on the med card. That is our top question. So Mark, you've been keeping busy.
Tell me
There's
about it.
I know a lot of things to keep track of. So yes, we are having a webcast just because of the sheer volume of questions. So hopefully you can attend that as well. But anyway, moving on here. How long do you keep MVRs? Well, because of the differences in CDL and non-CDL driver or the proof of medical certification requirements, there's some confusion. The new hire MVRs, or MVRs if the driver was licensed by more than one licensing authority in the past 3 years, are kept for duration of employment plus 3 years. So that's your new hire. So don't purge these MVRs. That's also a common mistake is, oops, we thought it was 3 years.
That one's on A&I, Kathy. A little further down the list, but it's on the FMCSA data as an audit problem.
Yeah. So that includes both CDL and non-CDL drivers that new hire MVR, even if you use the new hire MVR as proof of medical certification. So that's kept long term. To clarify that, since this is coming up as of late, there's no requirement for CDL drivers to get a new exam when they transfer to a new state after they obtain a new license. They have to get a new license within 30 days of establishing a new residence. That's in Part 383. An exam performed by a certified medical examiner that's on the registry, they're properly licensed by the state in which the exam was performed, so they could take that driver medical certification to any of the 50 states. It's good in 50 states. The concern is that the license number on the medical card won't match the one on the motor vehicle record, the MVR. The prior state's license should show the CDL CIDLIS information as being surrendered or a similar status. So any investigation or roadside in looking at the card would be able to detect that. And failing to maintain initial driving record in a driver's qualification file, that resulted in a maximum fine of $3,600. So it's important, to watch what you can purge and what you can't purge and when you can purge, because FMCSA is watching that. The annual MVRs and those used as proof of medical certification for your CDL drivers, they're all kept for 3 years. So.
Okay, great. Since we are down to our last 10 minutes, we are going to have time to answer one question under this category. And that question is going to be, We have a driver who only drives our fleet vans and our cars under 10,000 pounds. He does not have a CDL. Does he need a non-CDL med card?
If the van is not rated for more than, because this shouldn't be for compensation, so more than 15, including the driver, so it'd have to be a pretty large van. So if it's a smaller van and it doesn't weigh 10,001 pounds or greater, in the van part of it, it doesn't need a medical certificate. So if you look up in 390.5, that's the definition of a CMV, 10,001 pounds or greater, rated for 9 or more for compensation, including the driver, or more than 15. That's actually a CDL vehicle, more than 15, regardless of compensation. So you would not need a medical certificate for something that seats 8 or less, including the driver, not for, and less than 10,001 pounds, even if it was for compensation.
Okay, thank you for that, Mark. I am now going to hand it back over to you and Kathy for our final topic.
Yeah, thanks, Trish. And our question is, what if we are not compliant with the driver qualification rules? Well, we have talked about some compliance concerns as we went through the presentation here, and that one is, how do you handle non-compliance? What happens? Well, one result could be you wind up with a poor CSA score, compliance safety accountability score, and possibly flagged for an intervention. Interventions range from a warning letter to an on-site investigation or an audit. FMCSA, could place you out of service. Another result of non-compliance during on-site or remote audits could be acute and critical violations. An acute violation is it's a one-time violation. It could lead directly to an accident. Critical violations equal at least 10% of the documents audited. You have to show a pattern for that one. It shows a breakdown in your management controls. For example, an auditor could compare work assignments to when licensing was suspended or medical certifications lapsed, determine that the driver was operating as an unqualified driver. Or maybe there's missing DQ file documents that we talked about. Maybe they're missing the MVRs, or maybe there's no medical certificates. Besides a conditional or maybe an unsatisfactory safety rating from an audit, there could be fines or penalties. As you probably know, property carrying CSA scores were removed from the public view and probably will remain hidden for a while yet. We don't see any indication they're going to do that. However, they still are available if you log into your account. If you go into the carrier view, you can see what's being said about you. And they're still being used by enforcement, the CSA scores. There's enough information in the CSA that's visible to customers in the public view to call into question your safety if they would look at it. Now, you can still see passenger carrier CSA scores in the public view, though, if you're a passenger carrier attending today. And I recently had a question from a customer asking about their CSA scores because their insurance agent wanted to see them. I have heard customers and brokers were asking to see them as well, even though they're not public. So don't be surprised if you're asked to share that information as a term of doing business. And there's nothing prohibiting them from doing that or you for sharing it.
All right. And since we answered this question earlier in the program, this is basically a takeaway. It's a great analysis of 4 years worth of FMCSA audit fines, DQ file violations are in yellow, drug and alcohol are in green, and there's some pretty hefty amounts. So you want to avoid, Kathy covered quite a few, I covered a couple. So just use this as a takeaway because I don't want to bore you with all kinds of fine detail. Haha.
And we have a couple questions left in the queue, but before we move on to them, we'd like to once again offer our audience another opportunity to try Fleet Mentor absolutely risk-free. Fleet Mentor provides 24/7 access to dozens of ready-to-use fleet management tools, like the Driver Qualification Management tool. We're talking about having reminders. It's right there. Easy explanations on the regulations and policy templates. Just tons of great things to manage your program with. And along with your complimentary access, we'll email you our popular white paper, Top Fleet Management Practices. And I think there's a question or two to answer before we're at the top of the hour. I think there was one or two that we didn't get to. Mark, do you see one in the queue?
Yep, we have a few. So
Yes.
for the first question, it says, would a 15-passenger shuttle van owned by a hotel providing local transportation be considered for compensation?
FMCSA at the federal level considers them regulated as for hire. Indirect compensation is part of the room cost or the fee paid. If it's intra-state, it's not clear because it depends on the state. But if they're going to the airport and picking up people and continuing an interstate move, I would not want to have to defend a carrier that doesn't have a DQ file on that driver if it met FMCSA interstate criteria, because that's a continuation of an interstate move, should need a DQ file, and FMCSA's interpretations are in Appendix A to Part 391. Yeah, 390 if you want to find the hotel scenario.
Okay, thank you, Mark. It looks like we have time for one more question. Just a reminder, if we did not get to your question, we will send an email response. And for that question, if the company has a vehicle that has a GVWR rating below 10,001 pounds, but has a GCVWR above the 10,001 pounds because they occasionally haul a trailer, no hazmat, is the company required to keep a driver file if that driver does not meet the CGWR requirements?
Okay, I can take that one.
Oh, go ahead.
It does sound like it's a DOT regulated CMV when a trailer is attached. So when anyone operating that vehicle, when the trailer is attached, to get it over that 10,001 threshold combined weight, that person has to be fully qualified. If the trailer is not attached and the vehicle is below the 10,001 pounds and there's no hazmat involved, it's property carrying, I'm assuming there's not a passenger one with seats and stuff, then the person would not have to be qualified to operate that vehicle. But be careful when you have markings on that truck. We recommend having the temporary markings, take it off when it's not a CMV, put it on when it is, because it might appear to be a CMV on days when it's not.
Okay, Kathy. At this time, that is all the time we have for today. But for anyone who asked a question that wasn't answered, we will be following up via email to answer your questions individually. We hope that you all enjoyed today's webinar. I want to again thank Mark and Kathy for today's presentation. I also want to mention that this webinar will be available on demand on the Automotive Fleet website at automotive-fleet.com/webinars. I know I saw a question about going back to a previous slide, so you will have access to this recording, so you're able to visit the previous slide. But thank you. Have a great day. And I will hand it back over to Kathy and Mark for their closing remarks.
Well, thanks everybody for attending. We appreciate it. We hope you gleaned some points out of today's presentation.
Yeah, thanks for joining. Appreciate it.
Okay, guys.
Check
have
out
a good
Fleet
one.
Mentor.